Welcome to the Gospel Addict Podcast. I'm Bryan.
And I'm Jim Reski.
We're gospel addicts because we believe the gospel of Jesus isn't just good news, it's the best news ever.
We're addicted to the gospel because it doesn't just start us out in the Christian life, it is the Christian life.
Join us as we look at the Bible through the lens of the gospel.
Thanks so much for listening.
Welcome back to another episode of the Gospel Addict Podcast. I'm your host, Bryan, and I'm joined with a good friend of mine who happens to also be an author. And we go back quite a few years. My friend's name is Chris Bolinger. Chris calls himself an average Joe Christian, but he likes to write for guys. So he's really into writing men's devotionals. This is kind of fascinating because when I knew Chris, he wasn't in this kind of business. He was working as a product manager. There was a time when he spent close to 30 years working in the high-tech industry, but then he wanted to help small churches coming alongside their pastors and leaders, but that venture didn't work out so well. Since then, he has been the executive producer of a film called The Song, which I'm going to ask him about. But then he decided to write a men's devotional. Now, Chris and I know each other fairly well because we spent 2 years together in a men's discipleship program called CLC back in, I believe, 2013. But to my knowledge, Chris, you are not an author then. You had not written any books. So just briefly introduce yourself to our audience. Who is Chris Bolinger and how did you become an author?
Well, really, you mentioned CLC, and that is really what made me an author. So I'll give everybody a little backstory. So you and I met, I think it was 2012 or 2013, we got started with CLC. CLC now stands for Christ-Led Communities. It used to stand for something else, but it's a men's discipleship ministry that's been going on for, I think, 40 years now. And the sales pitch for CLC was pretty tough back when we went through it because they had one program. It was 2 years. It was 2 hours every week you got together. And there was a lot of work outside the meeting time. So when I found out about this
daily homework,
homework. Yeah. Reading your Bible, memorizing 50 Bible verses, reading other books like Mere Christianity and books by Tozer and other great authors. But the sales pitch, when I heard it, I went to a meeting. I'm not sure if you were in the same meeting, but at Christ Community Chapel in Hudson, they had a meeting of men that might be interested in this. And they kind of laid out the program. And I said, oh my gosh, what a huge commitment. I'd never done anything close to this. I had done Bible studies in small groups, but nothing like this. But I was at a point in my life where, I could count the number of close male friends who were Christians on like two fingers. I knew a lot of men. I went to church with a lot of men. I worked with a lot of men. I played tennis with a lot of men. Really did not connect with men at any kind of a level below surface level. And I will spare the audience all the details, but suffice it to say that I was very wary of having close friendships with men. I viewed men as competitors in the workplace and just really didn't know how to be myself and to be open and honest with men. So then I decided to do CLC. We started off the program by basically talking about ourselves. I think it was about an hour per guy. And, when you have a group like this, you realize that, guys are the same. We all have different issues but I was intimidated by men until I got in this group and I realized that, men are just like me. They've got their strengths, their weaknesses, and we all need prayer and we all need each other. We need Christ, but we also need the support and friendship of other men. So I went through CLC with you for 2 years, and then I did they had just come out with a follow-on program called Next Step. So I don't think you did that, right?
No, I remember I moved out of
Oh
town
yeah,
for
you
a
went to
short
Hawaii.
period of
That's
time.
right. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, so you were gone. So like six of us did that next program, and took us about 3.5 years total between the two programs. And so in 2016, I found myself without CLC. We had we had done all that they offered. We had their two programs all done.
You
And I kind of went back
graduated.
to my graduated, right. We were CLC grads. And I kind of went back to my old ways where, I wasn't reading my Bible every day, and I wasn't hanging out with men, and I was just kind of going back into my shell a little bit. And I said, well, let me find a good devotional, because I thought a devotional would kind of kickstart me and get me back into the Word. And so I looked for a couple of months, and I just couldn't find one that I really liked. I wanted something that was encouraging, and I found that a lot of men's devotionals were more prescriptive, like do this, don't do this, versus encouraging. But I also wanted to be challenging, because I like the challenge of CLC. So at the end of 2016, I said, well, I'll write a devotional. How hard could it be? And I discovered that it was actually very, very difficult. But once I started doing it, um, I found two things. One, I never felt closer to God than when I was doing this. I mean, sit down and look at I picked a bunch of encouraging passages from the Bible, and then I thought, well, what am I going to write about this passage? And just contemplating it and praying about it, I just felt really close to God. I mean, there were some days where the words flowed freely. There were some days where they didn't come very quickly, but it was just a great experience for me personally. And I also found that I was getting back into the Bible. And about a third of the way into the project, I decided just to do Old Testament verses, because I had done most of the devotions that I had done to that point were Old Testament. So, and that became an interesting challenge, because I had read the New Testament quite a bit, but I really hadn't read a lot of the Old Testament. And I was committed to having at least one passage from each Old Testament book. So the entire year 2017 was basically writing this book, and a little later on I'll talk about getting it published and all that. You asked me about myself, and I started talking about CLC in the book. I do consider myself an average Joe when it comes to most things, including the Christian faith. I mean, I'm not a biblical scholar. I've never had a staff position at a church. I've been a Christian, for as long as I can remember, and, rededicated my life to Christ as an early adult. But I try to write for guys like me. I try to write for guys who are kind of kicking tires on their faith. They're kind of on the sidelines, if you will, if you want to use a sports analogy, where they know they should be doing more. They know they should be following Christ more closely, being a better leader of the family, but they're just kind of hesitant to do that. So I write for guys like that, because that's the way that I've been most of my adult life. And what I try to do is just encourage men that, whether you look at men in the Bible, or, just people in their lives, most people are struggling in some ways. And even the men of the Bible were just ordinary guys. I mean, God used them to do amazing things, but um, most of the disciples and most characters in the Bible were not extraordinary people. They were very ordinary people. And so
Yes.
that's what I try to do in my writings. I write devotionals. I write for some publications online. And I do a podcast with another guy who is a CLC guy, and just really enjoying telling other people's stories to point people to Christ and the work that he does in ordinary people's lives.
That's awesome. Isn't it amazing when you make a small decision, like when you made that decision to do that CLC program, like that was life changing. That put you on a whole
Right.
another direction.
Yeah.
And
Changed my life. Seriously.
had you
Yeah.
been like, nah, not for me, too big of a commitment. Which by the way, I tried to recruit some of my friends to join our group, and I had the same roadblocks. Like 2 years, I can't
Yeah.
commit to a Bible study for 2 years. And but I'm so glad I did it. It was great because you really do realize that because most men, if we're honest, are lonely. Like
Yep.
we feel lonely because like you said, we are so competitive. We're afraid to show that we're insecure, and what's great about this group is 12 guys getting together for 2 years on a weekly basis for 2 hours and just sharing our lives together. I mean, it's really powerful, and I was excited to join it, because as a navigator staff, I'm real big on disciple making and discipleship, and I kind of knew that this is going to be a great experience. But when I tried to recruit other guys to it, it was challenging. It was hard, but I'm so glad you did it, Chris. So Chris,
Yeah, me too.
You were in 27 years in the high tech industry. You're a product manager. I'm just trying to get from the point where you were trying to find a good devotional, you couldn't find one, and then you just decide, I'm going to write a devotional. I mean, that's not usual.
Right.
So is some of that because you were a product manager? Like you just all of a sudden made this like your project?
Yeah, a little bit of it is. I mean, I started off my career mostly for software companies. I started off as an engineer, and frankly, I just couldn't cut it as an engineer. I was an okay engineer, but I wasn't as good as most of the guys around me. And so I went back, got my MBA, and moved into product management. And I really liked it because it got me, and I'm naturally an introvert, it got me out in front of customers. So I had to overcome some fears in doing that. But the goal of the job is to find out what customers really need, not what they say they want, but what they really need. And then to go back to the development team and say, can we build this? People are asking for this. Can we build it? And can we build it in a way that's better than our competitors can offer? And I had the good fortune of working for some really good software companies. So usually our product was the best in the market for, it was niche computer stuff, but it was really for the businesses that we sold to, we had the best product in the market. And so I kind of had this mindset of find what people need, find a need and then fill the need. That was really the back half of my career. And then at the very end of my career, 5 of us left Cisco Systems, which made our wives kind of upset because we all had kind of cushy jobs working for Cisco, which is a big tech company based in Silicon Valley. And we were in Ohio doing Wi-Fi stuff. But there was no future in it in Cisco. So we started our own Wi-Fi company in Akron. And that was a great experience for me because then I really had to, there were just 5 of us. I really had to get to know the customers at an intimate level and really find out what they needed and what we could do to meet those needs. So when I left high tech, I still had this product management mindset. And so I think one of the reasons that I wrote the book was I did see a need, not only in me, I couldn't find a devotional that I liked, but I figured if I can't find one, there's probably a lot of other guys out there that can't find one as well. Because the devotional market, like the book market in general, is primarily products that are marketed to women. And even with men's devotionals, what most publishers do is they try to attract the wife. So she'll pick this up and she'll give it to her husband. Now, the husband may say, thank you very much, and put it on the shelf and never look at it, but they got a sale anyway, right? So part of me wanted to offer something that men would want themselves and would actually read. Now, truth be told, a lot of my book sales have been to women because it's a very attractive book. My first book, Daily Strength for Men, it's got a beautiful faux leather cover on it. You open it up, it's printed on very nice pages. It has a great look and feel. And so there, yeah, you're holding it up. So about half my sales have come on the inspirational reading racks that you'll see in a supermarket or a gas station. People have seen it on the Turnpike, the Ohio Turnpike. They're at CVS. And so, people will be looking for a gift for a husband or a son, and they'll pick it up and give it as a gift. So I don't want to besmirch women buying books, because that's great, but I do think that was the only bridge I can think of between my high-tech job, which really did not involve much writing, and never writing for individual people. It was always, business to business. With my transition to an author, I think it's that I was just trying to be a good product manager.
Well, let me say, I have both of your books here. For somebody who didn't go to journalism school, wasn't set out, wasn't necessarily trying to become an author, these are excellent books. You did a great job. I was just reading in the Daily Strength for Men. It starts out in Genesis, chapter 1, verse 1, the first verse of the Bible. I read the first couple days, what it means to be made in the image of God. You've got some great content there, and it seems like you do a good job just kind of grabbing some of the best content out there from
I steal from everybody.
Well, and that's good, because there's a lot of it's better that it's not just many minds. Originality is the art of forgetting your source.
Right.
Somebody told me that.
That's very good. I've never heard that before. That's excellent.
So I can't remember who said that, so it must be original with me. So you can say Greg Bryan said originality.
Hey, you should copyright that.
How long does it take you to write a book?
The first one took me about a year. It took me,
which I think that's pretty amazing. I mean, I don't think that's normal to be able to, that's the 365-day devotional.
Right.
You wrote that in 1 year.
Well, my daughter Hope, I have two daughters. My middle child, she writes Christian fiction, and she can literally write a 300-page novel in like 2 weeks. I can't do. It takes me a year to. I think a year is probably about average. I've talked to guys who have taken 5-6 years to write a book, and then there are some guys who can write 3 or 4 a year. The second book, 52 Weeks of Strength for Men, it's a little different format, so it's not a devotion every day or every other day. It's one per week. That took me about 6 months. And the way that I write, I said that I steal from the best. Again, going back to my days working as a product manager, I like doing research. I like reading stuff. I like getting online. I like seeing what different people say about something. And then I try to give a fresh perspective, even on stuff that I've read. So for my second book, I was looking at, I think it was patience as one of the topics. And the Kurt Warner movie came out after I wrote the book, but I think I had read something on it. And, Kurt Warner's this famous story of a guy that, he played one good year of college football quarterback, and then, no pro team would look at him, ends up, I think, stocking shelves in a grocery store or something like that. And then, the miracle story, he ends up playing for what was then the St. Louis Rams and goes to the Super Bowl, MVP of the Super Bowl, all in like 1 or 2 years. Fantastic story. But what I thought about was, what about the guys who are very talented and never really get their shot? So I was reading this article, I think it was Sports Illustrated or ESPN, about a guy that had been in the minor leagues of baseball for like 16, 17 years. And at the time of the articles being written on him, he still hadn't made it to the majors. And so, why does somebody continue to do that? And my stories are not always about Christians. And in this particular case, I don't know if he was a Christian or not, but the gospel the Bible it's you see it in all these stories. I mean, and this guy said that he just loved he was playing a kid's game as an adult, and the joy was in the journey for him. He saw God's handiwork in being allowed to do something like that, even though he was just in the minors. After those stories, he ended up going to the majors, but I think he only came to bat like 12 times, and then that was it for. It reminded me of Field of Dreams, where the one guy, who's a doctor in the movie, he got called up to the majors once back in like the 20s or 30s, and then never got to go to the plate, and his line, in the movie was, somebody said, well, how heartbreaking for you to never have gotten a chance to hit in the major leagues. And he said, he became a doctor, and he said, no, the true heartbreak would have been if I hadn't become a doctor, I hadn't saved people's lives. So I think a lot of times we get caught up in where we want to go with life, and we lose sight of where God wants to take us, and enjoying where God has us, even if we're in a difficult place. I mean, God has us there for a reason. So I find stories like this, and if something strikes me as really just fascinating or moving, then I figure I should pass that along, and that's what I try to do.
That's great. Speaking of your second book, 52 Weeks of Strength for Men, I was looking at your the topic of anger. Uh-huh. And I thought that was really cool that you put that in there. It's pretty early on in the book that you address men and their anger. And I love the opening story is a little more lighthearted than what you just shared of Hulk and Thor in the movie Ragnarok, which I love that movie, by the way.
Yeah.
That dialogue between Hulk and Thor is great, about how Hulk says, I always get angry. And but you do a great job just addressing, the biblical perspective on anger and so the content I'm just really impressed with. Do you how long did it take you to write the second book?
I think it was about 6 months. I mean, the writing process ends up being really long, because when you think you're done, that's when it's just beginning, because, you have to proofread, and it's helpful to have somebody else proofread. And then if you get the good fortune of having a publisher accept your manuscript, well, you may have to make a lot of changes to suit the publisher's needs. My first book, I'd never written one before. I had no idea what format I should use. So I ended up having to shorten almost every one of my devotions by like 30%. So I had to go and cut because it just didn't fit in on the page. And then the other funny thing was, I thought it was a great idea because I love music. A really easy devotion for me to write would be to bring up a topic, have a Bible verse, bring up a topic related to the verse, and then here's a song with great lyrics that applies to this particular passage. You can't do that. They're all copyrighted. So I had like 20 of my devotions in the first book that were just basically very little of Chris's input and then long song lyrics. And the publisher said, you have to change all. I had to rewrite all of them. So that's why I think I was done with the original draft of Daily Strength for Men in about 7 or 8 months, but then rewriting a lot of it. And then I had a deadline. So that became pretty challenging to, when the clock's running and you've got to get stuff done, it's difficult, but I enjoyed it in some ways because it really kept me sharp in terms of, okay, I've got to make it fit and I've got to be crisp and clear in what I'm writing. So, but truth be told, I'd rather not have a deadline hanging over my head. Have a little more time.
Does writing energize you or exhaust you?
I think that for the most part, it energizes me, especially when I have time. If I'm sitting down and I'm, just in the early stages of writing a book, then I'm having a ton of fun because I'm researching stuff. I'm saying, oh yeah, I can use this here, and I'm kind of slotting stuff and putting it on the schedule. Late in the game or during the editing process, I think it exhausts me just because you've got to read very, very carefully to try to catch errors. And I'm terrible at reading my own stuff. And after a while, I don't want to read it anymore. I wrote it and I've read it like 10 times. I don't read it anymore. So I failed to catch a lot of typos in the second book until very, very late.
Okay, so here's a question for you. So what was one of the most surprising things you learned in creating your books?
I would say, I don't know if it's surprising so much, but I try to be very thoughtful. Mostly because I'm hiding behind other people and I don't think people really care what I think for the most part. I mean, who am I? I'm just some unknown guy who, spends half the year in Ohio and half the year in Florida. So I try to be very balanced in what I present. I want it to be, biblically solid, but I also want it to be engaging for the reader, and I want the reader to think. And so I think what has surprised me quite a bit is how difficult it is to write questions at the end of a devotion. Because CLC taught me that. I mean, the best thing about CLC is that you get questions and you have a discussion. And I think you learn a lot by really grappling with questions. So, yeah, it's hard to write questions because you have to kind of reopen the whole thought process and say, okay, if I were reading this, what would I want to be challenged with, or what might draw more out of this content with a question? But what I guess surprised me the most is how tough it is to answer your own questions. So I wrote all the questions for Daily Strength for Men, and there's questions in 52 weeks as well. But then my wife and I were looking for a couples devotional, and I said, well, let's just do mine. We couldn't find one that we like, so we'll just do mine. It's written for men, but we can do it as a couple. So now I had to answer my own questions in front of my wife. That was very, very difficult in many cases, just because, I mean, I had the luxury of not really having to answer them when I wrote them. Oh, this will be a tough one. I'll make guys answer this one. Now I have to answer it. So I would say that that was a bit surprising, but it was rewarding in a way because my wife and I, she's a good critic. She and I'll read something that I've written and we'll kind of laugh about it because, it sounded different when I wrote it. But there were some questions that were I thought were kind of stupid questions that I had in there. So we'd laugh about the stupid ones, but then we'd encounter a question that was really thought-provoking. And I think that was kind of surprising how much you could get out of a single question that was at the end of a devotion and a couple of Bible passages.
What would you say is your interesting writing quirk? Is there any like quirks that to kind of get you into the writing frame of mind? Like I have to be at a certain desk, or I have to, it has to be between this. Is there a certain time of day where you have to?
Yeah, that's a good question.
What would your wife say? What would your wife say would be your quirks when it comes to your writing?
I think I like to kind of hide when I write. My son is the opposite. If my son has, schoolwork to do or he's writing a paper, he wants to be in a coffee shop with a bunch of noise around him. And I don't work that way. There are times where I can do that. I might have music on at times, but usually I want to have a quiet place without interruptions. And for me, I guess my quirk is that I take an awful long time to get started. I almost have to write the first paragraph or two, and it has to be exactly right. And then I can write the rest. I know some people kind of lay things down, or they'll just kind of type and type and type. They'll just write and write and write, and then they'll kind of piece it together later on, or they'll refine it. And I'm not that way. I kind of have to, it's almost a hill of my own making. I have to get over the first hill. And then once I've done that, then I can write more freely.
Did you ever experience
Yeah.
writer's block?
Yeah.
And how long did
And
that last?
couple of days. And again, it helps not to be on a deadline. Um, but yeah, I hate wasting time, but there are some days I can't just stare at a blank screen. I mean, used to be you'd stare at a blank piece of paper, but now I'm writing on a computer. So if I can't think of something for a while, then I'll go do some research, or I'll, read the Bible, or I'll do something else just to kind of get things going. But I don't want to get super frustrated, but I also don't want to walk away. So I do want to get something down on paper. So if I'm having writer's block on one thing, then because I'm doing a devotional, maybe I can jump to a different topic and accomplish something there. That's why I don't know how my daughter writes novels, because if I was writing a novel and I had writer's block, I don't know what I would do. I mean, if you're stuck, I don't know how she gets, but she apparently never has it because she writes a whole novel in a couple of weeks. So I envision sparks coming off the keys when she's writing, because she's just writing so fast. It's just unbelievable.
That's amazing. That's amazing. Does she help you at all? Has she helped you at all in any of these
She
books?
did. Yeah, she helped me a lot, especially with the first one. She wrote all the prayers in the first one because I joke that I can't write prayers. I take all this energy and put it in the devotion, and I make sure that I get the Bible passages that I want, and I'm real happy with it. And I spend time on the questions, and then I've got to write a prayer, and it's like, oh, I can't write the prayer. Nothing's coming to mind. So I guess I have writer's block on prayers. So she did all of those for the first one.
They're real
And
nice too.
then,
They're simple.
yeah,
They're like
yeah,
two sentence prayers,
yep,
but they're
which is
they're
what I wanted. I mean, I gave her some guidance, and I said, well, for space reasons as well as just I like short to the point prayers. I'm not a flowery prayer. Um, and the other thing she helped me with was, even though she was in college at the time, she's become a real expert on the publishing industry, and she had a lot of contacts in the publishing industry and knew how you submit things to publishers for them to consider it. So I don't remember if she connected me to the publisher that I ended up getting, but she certainly helped me get some good proposals out there and feel more confident that I might get it published.
It's interesting because you do have two different you have so as of this interview, you have published two books.
Right.
Okay. You've published two books, two different publishers, right?
Right. Right.
And explain to people why two different publishers. Because I would think once you're hooked in with one, that they would just grab your,
Yeah. Right. Um, I think that happens for some people. um, Publishing it's a very getting a book published is very, very difficult. Now, that being said, you can self-publish a book, and it's very, very easy. Um, and it doesn't cost you anything. I mean, there's different ways to publish. You can self-publish with they're called hybrid publishers, and they might charge you a flat fee to give you marketing and to give you editing, give you other services. But you can go on the Kindle system, the Amazon system, and you can publish your book literally for free. You can design your own cover, you can lay your book out, and it will be available on Amazon worldwide, and it costs you nothing. And you get revenue from it. If you sell a book, you get a percentage. I think it's less than 30%, but it's not bad. But the downside of self-publishing is that typically a self-published author will sell maybe a couple hundred copies of a book. And if your goal is to have a bigger reach than that, and you ever go to a traditional publisher after having self-published, they pretty much won't talk to you, because they'll say, well, have you written any other books? And you say, oh yeah, I've written 3. How'd they do? Well, I sold, 200 copies of each. And they say, well, we're not interested. So in my case, I was extremely fortunate to get Broad Street as my publisher. There are people who work for publishers called, I think it's development. Their job is development. That may be wrong. It may be the wrong term, but they basically they're on the prowl. They're scouting for potential books that the publisher might publish. And the guy who was in that role at Broad Street in late 2017, he saw my proposal and he liked it and he gave me a shot. And that happens very, very rarely. So I was very blessed to have that with Broad Street. But I thought the same thing you thought when the book started selling well.
Because the book, that book has, let's talk about it. That book has sold well over 150,000 copies, right?
Yeah, it's 250,000 now. Yeah, it's
250 of that one book.
Of that one book. Yeah,
okay.
It's just been unbelievable.
I have heard that 90%, or there's some crazy statistic, like 90% of all books published never sell more than 5,000 copies. Is that the statistic?
Yeah.
Does that sound right?
That's what I've heard. Yeah.
90% never sell more than 5,000. Yeah. This book has sold 250,000. So why aren't they just like, did you try to publish your second book with them?
I went with, I didn't have a proposal for them per se, but I went to them a couple of years after the book was published and I said, look, the book's doing really well. Would you like me to do another one? I could do more Daily Strength for Men, or, we could play off the title. And they said no. And I was kind of taken aback, and I think I followed up at some point, but I never really got a good answer as to why. Now I have my suspicions, and my suspicion is that the publisher does a lot of devotionals, and they have a terrific team. So the books all look great. The inside, outside, terrific quality. And they sell a lot of books on
they've got that niche
inspirational racks.
They've got that niche, right? Because
I've got the niche, right?
I've seen them in the stores. They have those racks.
Yep.
And a lot of times I'm pulled over to those racks because of the covers, because you can tell they're just set apart a little bit.
Yep. I haven't studied it, but I have to believe that Broad Street does very, very well in that niche, because a lot of the books on the choice books, inspirational reading racks are from Broad Street. They look great. They're very high quality. As an author, I think that my book is popular because it's got good content. And I think that plays into it. But I think, like I said earlier, you can't dispute that the beautiful quality of the book certainly helps with the sales. And I think it helps with people's impression. I mean, you can get an ebook of anything these days, but when you have a nice leather-bound book with, beautiful quality, it just seems better. For me at least, I'd rather have that kind of a book. So I think that Broad Street basically can do that type of business without my help, is the bottom line. I mean, the book's done great. I'm sure Broad Street's very happy, but I think that Broad Street probably figured, well, we can do other books in this genre that will do pretty well too, and we don't need the hassles of working with Chris, because I said, I mean, I was a complete moron when we came, so I think we came pretty close to missing the deadline when it came down to it, because I was furiously rewriting devotions and trying to get stuff to fit, and I think that's got to be draining on a publisher to have to deal with an author who doesn't really know what he's doing.
That's amazing.
So I found Crosslink. Crosslink is a small publisher actually out of South Dakota. And again, was blessed to get a contract with them for 52 weeks. But that particular book doesn't have a leather cover. And so you're probably not going to find it on the choice books rack. You're more likely to order that one online. Mm-hmm. I mean, you might find it in a Christian bookstore, but let's face it, how many Christian bookstores are there these days? They're not on every corner. There's a couple in Northeast Ohio. There's a couple in Southwest Florida, but there's just not as many as there used to be. So
Right.
most people buy their books online, and these days a lot of people are going with ebooks just because
But
they're cheaper and they're easier.
the thing that you got going for you on this book though is the foreword is by Kyle Idleman.
Yeah.
That he's very well known. So
Yeah.
that, and you got it right on the front there. I mean, is this book doing okay?
It's doing okay. It's just I've been so spoiled by the Daily Strength for Men that, I don't know if any book I could write could even
Outdo
come
that one.
close to how that one's done.
Which that brings me to a question, Chris. What do you consider literary success to look like? Like what do you want? What do you've put these out here. What does success look like for you?
I have to remind myself that that's a question where I really need to think about what God wants for this. And I say that because, the sales have been great. I get a royalty, not a huge one, but I get a royalty on every book. So, that's great for me. But it's the emails that I get. It's the people I talk to occasionally who say, this book had a big impact on me. I got one a week or two ago from a guy who really liked the book, liked Daily Strength for Men. He had written me before and told me how much he enjoyed it, how much it had helped him in his walk with Christ. And I was emailing people that had purchased books just to let them know about 52 weeks and, contact me if they had any questions. And he wrote me back and he said that he's friends with a guy who's not a Christian. And I think that they do bicycling together. They do some activity together. And he's always been trying to approach this guy to talk to him about Jesus and just didn't know, wasn't sure how to do it. And he said the Holy Spirit was prompting him to give this guy my book. So he did. And still, that took some courage. I mean, he didn't know how the guy would react because they really haven't talked about anything spiritual. And he said the guy really likes the book. And now he can talk to this guy about spiritual stuff. And it's broken the ice. And to me, that's success, right? I mean, that's success in eternal terms, right? And at the end of the day, it really doesn't matter how many people buy my book. I get one of those stories, right? And something I've done, God's used something I did to bless somebody else and potentially to help somebody evangelize a friend and bring him into the kingdom of God. So now I'll complain as much as the next person about how my book's not selling. I mean, I'd love my books to sell well, but what I
hear you saying is
it,
success has changed lives. And
right.
I feel the same way. I mean, that's part of the reason why I do this podcast is like, I'm just, trusting that maybe something in the podcast is going to change somebody's life, bring them to faith or deepen their faith. Or, I mean, this is a really interesting interview because you're a guy that you never set out to be an author.
Right.
And basically, this kind of calling kind of found you, at a really interesting time in your life. So one of my questions was going to be, do you hear from your readers much? And you just shared a story about hearing from one of your readers. So does that happen a lot?
Not a lot. I don't blame people. I mean, I don't think I've ever contacted an author except for Kyle Idleman. And that's a long story that I won't tell, but I ended up getting to meet him, back in 2014, 2015. And he was gracious enough to agree to write the foreword in my second book. Cause he's just a great guy. But I do get contacted, I think, more by people when I write an article. So I write articles for crosswalk.com, which is a Salem online media publication. And I'm also writing for Biblical Leadership. I'm doing some devotions for them. When I write on a topic, one of them I've written on is divorce. I'll get guys emailing me. They see my contact information at the bottom of the article, and they just share heartbreaking stories. I think I've gotten more emails on the topic of divorce than anything else I've written on in any of my devotionals. Um, but to me, that's an indication that, like we said at the outset of the show, a lot of guys are lonely. They're going at life on their own, right? They don't have anybody they can confide in. Even if they're Christians and they go through something tough, they don't perceive that they have somebody at their church or in their life that they can sit down with and confide in or ask for help. So they contact somebody they've never met who wrote an article. I mean, they don't know me,
Yeah.
but I mean, sometimes they contact me multiple times and, they ask me what I think. And I'm always very careful not to give them advice. I try to point them to the Bible. I try to point them to Christ. So in some cases, I say you really should get a counselor, or you should find somebody at your church to talk to your pastor. Um, but yeah, I think that men in general are just struggling. They're going at life alone or with very few brothers around them, and we're not supposed to do that.
Yeah. Um, so I just have a couple more things and we'll wrap up.
Okay.
You have 2 books published. Do you ever read your book reviews?
Yeah, yeah, I do.
What is
Um,
that like for you?
it's for the most part, it's again, I'm not the most humble guy, but I'm really a nobody when it comes to to writing books. So just to read a review where somebody says, "Wow, this book is great." In some cases they'll say, "My son really likes it. My husband really likes it." Sometimes they get more personal. This has really helped me. Those mean the world to me. But there are some funny ones. I have one review on Amazon in the UK. A guy bought like 3 or 4 copies for everybody in his family, and he hates it. He says it's poorly written. He gives it 2 stars out of 5, and that's my only review in the UK. So apparently, it's not doing well in the UK. And then I have one guy that reviewed it and said, I read somewhere that this is only Old Testament verses, and that's not true, because what I do is the main verse for a devotion is the Old Testament, but then I'll bring in a New Testament passage to go along with the Old Testament passage. So he said, this is not just Old Testament, and he really liked the book. And then a different guy recently was complaining because he says the book has no New Testament passages, no gospel in it. And so he gave it 1 star. So it's feast or famine. I either get 5 stars from somebody who defends the book using the New Testament, or I get 1 star from somebody who says it doesn't have any New Testament. So you just have to laugh. I mean,
If you have
my
somebody that's been reading Oswald Chambers, every year for 20 years,
right.
or Charles Spurgeon or something, I mean, yeah, it's yeah. I'm glad that you take it that way. You just you do. You just have to laugh because you never know.
I'm just hoping it, my goal, I'm not the best writer on the planet. My goal is to first and foremost get people into their Bible, but secondly, get them to think, and then spark conversations. I mean, my wife and I did it together. With 52 weeks, I'm really hoping that groups of guys will do it. I kind of wrote it with the weekly format. I was kind of hoping, and I'm still hoping, that groups of guys at a church or guys that, go golfing together, whatever, will just say, "Hey, we've been talking about some stuff. Why don't we get this book and have a weekly discussion about the topics that he provides?" So if I can get people into their Bible and get them talking with each other and supporting and encouraging each other, then that's great. It doesn't really matter if it's well written or not. I mean, I want it to be well written, but if I can get people walking more closely with Jesus just a tiny bit, then that's
I mean, you are
a great
connecting them
thing.
to the Bible, which is connecting them to the Lord. So The
Right.
Daily Strength for Men is 365 days of devotionals. There's one for every day. I'm curious just about the format. Why did you choose, in the second one, the 52 weeks of Strength for Men? Why did you choose that weekly format?
I did it for a couple reasons. One, in Daily Strength, there are a lot of themes. And originally, I thought there might be an index in the book. So if you wanted to read about faith, then it would tell you, okay, well, here's the devotions on faith. If you wanted to read on hope or love or peace or anger or some other topic, it would give you a list. We couldn't do it. I mean, like I said, we were against the clock just to get the book out. So we couldn't have any additional things in there. I think a lot of guys like to read on topics. My joke on devotionals is that, it's kind of like Forrest Gump and a box of chocolates. You never know what you're going to get. I mean, just because it's April 3rd, you have no idea what's going to be the devotion for April 3rd, what the verse is going to be. It's just there's no rhyme or reason to it. And so I thought with a weekly format, I still have 7 passages for them to read, but it's all topical. And so I thought that guys, either as individuals or small groups of guys, could say, hey, the first 13 weeks in this are about the nature of God. The second 13 weeks are on God in your day-to-day life. Then there's big topics, and then there's tough topics. You can do it as a study with a couple of buddies. And, you can do whatever you want. I mean, if you want to skip a topic, if you want to spend a couple of weeks on a topic, that's up to you. But that was really my goal, is a little meatier on the devotion side. There are 2.5 pages per devotion instead of just one. But really getting into some of these topics in a little more depth while not overloading guys with, a lot of reading. So that was it was something new. One thing I try to do is do something different. And maybe it works, maybe it doesn't. Like the first one is all Old Testament. I had not seen a devotional that was all Old Testament verses, so I thought, what the heck? Let's try it and see how it does. And so the second one, I've seen a couple of 52-week format books out there, but very few. So I thought, well, we'll give it a try and see if people like it. If they don't like it, then I'll do something different next time.
I like that. And when you're I think that's probably one of the keys to your success, is that you're willing to try something different and willing to fail. I mean, you right. When we knew each other and we were in CLC, you really had a heart for small churches, and you were really trying to come alongside and help them. And that project didn't work.
That was an absolute failure. And you mentioned the song earlier on, and I was an executive producer on the song, which is the best Christian movie that nobody ever saw. Fantastic movie, right?
Is it out there? Is it on YouTube?
It came out. You can find it in a couple places. It used to be on DVD, but fabulous movie. I got to know the people, the creative team behind it. Producer, director, the writer, all wonderful people, and the movie just bombed. So, after I retired from high tech, I went through this sequence of trying stuff. And this was probably, God waiting for me to rely on him, instead of on my own. But I tried the small church thing. I tried the investing in the movie. I tried investing in another project that was multimedia based, all complete failures. But,
what year was the movie put out?
2014.
I wonder, It seems like today's, with the Phantom, the way they're doing some of these Christian movies and showing them, I wonder if it would do better in today's kind of atmosphere, and how they're promoting smaller films. But
There's
you're saying it's out there. If you Google the song, it's out there. People can find it and see it.
Yeah,
what is the basic? What is a 2-sentence plot line?
It's basically King Solomon, set in modern time as a singer. So his dad is David King, who's a famous country singer. And then he's Jedediah. he's Jed King, but as you know, Jedediah is the other name for Solomon, and it's supposedly based on the Song of Solomon, but it's really more based on Ecclesiastes. And it's a very gritty movie. It really, he gets in, shows his temptations. But it's a very, redeeming movie at the end. And I just thought it was such a clever script and so well done. But, that's movies. You'll have a very well written movie that does terribly, and then you'll have a movie that's, in my opinion, not very good, and it makes, $100 million. So, but I learned a lot in that process, and like I said, I think it was more the case of God. My relationship with God is, God's very patient with me. Eventually, God will, take a bat and kind of hit me with the bat or nudge me with the bat to get me doing something. But for the most part, God waits until I wake up and decide to follow him and do what he wants me to do. So I appreciate the patience of God, and just appreciate the opportunity to be writing these books and these articles, and to be used by God, to have my written words used by God to reach people.
That's fantastic. Okay, two final thoughts. One is, are you working on any future projects? And then how can people get in touch with you? Like if they're interested in learning more, or checking out the books that you've got published, what's the best way for them to get in touch with you? Maybe start with that and then talk about it.
Yeah. I've got a website with a couple different URLs. You can go to chrisbolinger.com if you can remember how to spell my name, but rather than telling you that, I would just go to mensdevotionals.com. It's the same website, just, redirects you to the website. So Men's Devotionals, no apostrophe, because you can't put that in a URL, but mensdevotionals.com. I'm on Facebook, LinkedIn, Instagram, Twitter, although I don't spend much time on Twitter because Twitter is not my jam. And in terms of what I'm working on now, a book that I'd really like to write, and I'm not sure if I will do this coming year. I'd like to. I'm fascinated by the earliest Christians. I'm finding more and more evidence that Christianity kind of exploded on the scene shortly after the resurrection of Jesus. And, we talk about when were the New Testament books written, and there's arguments about that. But these people very, very quickly understood who Jesus is, what he had done, and what it meant for them. I mean, they started worshiping on Sundays, which we take it for granted now, but it was such a dramatic change. And I'd like to write, maybe it'll be a devotional, maybe something else, but I'd really like to expose people to what the earliest Christians accomplished, because it's just fascinating to me. My favorite book is Acts. It's always been Acts. I'm just fascinated by what these ordinary people did. Jesus ascended, and, they're staring up at the sky. Their leader ascended, and, and then Pentecost comes. But it's just, I think we underplay how extraordinary all of this was in just, a handful of years. I'm fascinated by Peter and what he did, Mark, Paul, obviously the other disciples, but just, I'll try to say it real quickly. I was researching Pilate because there's the one verse in, I think it's Matthew, where Pilate's wife comes up to him and says, have nothing to do with this man because I had a dream about him. And I started thinking, how did this verse end up in the Bible? And the only conclusion I could come to was that Pilate's wife was a Christian, because I think I think it was commonly known that had taken place because she had told people. And then I found out that both she and Pontius Pilate himself are are considered saints by some of the Orthodox churches. So they believe that Pontius Pilate actually became a Christian. And to me, that's just fascinating that, the person who, when we say the creeds, he suffered under Pontius Pilate. I mean, and the fact that I can't prove it, but it's possible that the man who sentenced Jesus to die ended up becoming a follower of his. So it's just, so that you can tell I'm excited about it. I don't know if this is a book that I can write. I don't know if I can get it published, but I think this is a story worth telling to people. So I'm going to try to find a way to do that.
Best of luck in the future, Chris. And I hope we can stay in touch.
Oh, absolutely.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Gospel Addict Podcast. Feel free to contact us via email at gospeladdictpodcast@gmail.com.
Stay tuned for our next episode, and remember, on your worst days, you're never beyond the reach of God's grace, and on your best days, you're never beyond the need of God's grace.
See you next time.